This morning, we're going to look at what Mary, the mother of Jesus, says about herself, the world, and God in the first chapter of Luke. Now, in the Protestant Reformed tradition, we don't venerate Mary, and we don't pray to her. Still, Mary is a major figure in Scripture, and so she deserves some thoughtful consideration. Also today, as we've said, is Mother's Day, and some of us may not be mothers. We may deeply miss a mother who is no longer with us. We may have lost her recently or many years ago. Others of us may not necessarily have pleasant memories of our mothers, or perhaps we never knew our mothers. Perhaps we are mothers and we're not in contact with our children, or our children refuse to be in contact with us, or we don't have the relationship we would like to have with our children. Regardless of what we may know, feel, or experience about mothers and mothering, I'm inviting you to join with me in looking at Mary's legacy of caregiving. And this morning, I would like to highlight three elements of Mary's legacy. First of all, Mary's willingness to be a servant of God. Secondly, Mary's certainty of God's care for her and God's mindfulness of what Mary needed. And finally, Mary's reliance on God's justice and God's goodness. All of us are caregivers. At home, we might care for people or perhaps pets or neighbors. Possibly we're responsible just for caring for ourselves by ourselves. And if you are, then that's still care. Self-care is still caregiving. At work, we might be interacting with other people. We may be giving them care in the form of advice, guidance, or direction. If we're an employer, we're providing income for people. That's a form of care. If we're an employee, then we are providing or creating a product or a service that's valuable to people. That's a form of care. At school or in our neighborhoods, perhaps we are showing someone how to solve a problem, providing a new approach to something, teaching a new skill. In church, we may be showing care through committee work, through leadership service. Perhaps we're just really good at greeting a first-time visitor, shaking someone's hand, and making them feel welcome. All of this is care, all of it's meaningful, and all of it has a spiritual dimension. In our first reading, we hear Mary's response to the angel Gabriel's announcement of Mary's God-assigned mission. Help bring Jesus into the world and care for him. In Luke 1:38, Mary says, "I am the Lord's servant." When we are presented with a challenge or a surprise, as some of us were this morning, a task which seems difficult, perhaps an unwanted task, something is unreasonable, perhaps in our mind it's even unachievable, wouldn't it be wonderful if our first response could be, "I am the Lord's servant"? How often do we tend to just instead say to ourselves, I'm doing this because I have to, or I'm doing this because I'm afraid not to do it? How much more confidence, love, and endurance might we bring to whatever task we have as caregivers if we could see our care for ourselves and for others as a service to God? That service is fully in God's will, and it's guided by God's goodness, by God's power, and therefore the outcome is in fact guaranteed by God. As the Lord's servant, Mary was not responsible for making it turn out just right. Mary was not responsible for other people's reactions to her mission or their opinions. Mary is responsible for believing and acting. Mary's acceptance of God's mission didn't come without a question. She asked, "How can this be?" When her question was answered, Mary then said, "I am the Lord's servant." This conversation between Mary and the angel demonstrates how God welcomes our honest questions. Honest questions are good things because they show some thoughtfulness, they show belief, they show confidence in the person we're asking the question of, and they show a willingness to take the next step.